if you're a commercial farm, your failures are the gilts that you don't get bred or you don't find in heat. So set up a system, work with somebody that can help you. Just take a look at the ovaries and see what's there. So if most of your ovarian morphology in your slaughter check is a normal CL, a normally developed ovary, then your problem is boar exposure heat detection. If it's you have undeveloped ovaries or ovaries with very few CLs or few CAs, then it's probably somewhere in the gilt development. And my bias would be it would probably be somewhere sort of in the early developmental period in the multiplier and how those gilts are managed, after birth and the colostrum and things like that. So that would be a good first step.
Well, good day. This is the Swine podcast for Canada. Ruud Zelstra, and today I have with me Dr. Billy Flowers from North Carolina State University. Welcome, Billy.
Thank you, Ruud.
Nice to see you today. And today we'll be discussing one of the topics of your expertise, which is gilt development and sow longevity. So let's get right in. When are most females culled or removed from production?
So at least to answer that question, I rely on a lot of folks that manage these databases, from large production systems, and they report all these benchmarking data. And really, it's quite interesting that about 80% of the gilts never made, or most of 80% of the removals are gilts that are delivered to commercial sow farms, but are never actually bred or enter production. So these would be gilts that are delivered to the sow farms or raised internally by the own sow farm, and then they never find them in heat, or they find them in heat once and they don't come back in heat to be rebred. So it really appears it's that initial entry point is the biggest thing. And then after that, it's a smaller percentage, but it's after their first lactation. So the big loss is they never get into production. And then once you get them into production, there's a little bit of higher loss for first parity sows in the rebreeding interval than compared to older sows.
Yeah. So what are some of the reasons why this 80% happens that never gets improved?
Yeah, so a lot of times I think originally when we first started doing this, and one of your former colleagues, Dr. George Foxcroft, used to say it was they didn't know how to check for estrus and they wouldn't give proper boar exposure. So it was the animals were physiologically capable of coming into estrus, but they weren't just being identified in heat. And so I think that was true initially. Recently, I've visit a lot of farms here in the U.S., especially in North Carolina, and they've adopted a lot of George's recommendations, or the recommendations that came from the University of Alberta there about, the bear system and how you give boar exposure and things like that. And they're still having some problems. And so I think, boar exposure and correct boar exposure is definitely an issue. Some of the things we're going to talk about later, though, is that some of our change, I'll say the productivity of our maternal line genetics may also be involved. And we can talk a little bit about that later, but when we talk about the critical periods. But probably the biggest point is, proper boar exposure once they get to the farm and stuff.
But throughout your career, do you have seen some changes in this phenomenon?
It's really kind of interesting that I think that part of the issue is as our litter sizes have gotten larger, they've especially gotten larger on our multiplication farms that would, supply all the commercial sows for the production farms. What you tend to see is average birth weight has gotten smaller, or there's been more diversity in birth weight. And probably compared to like when I first started, for example, just to give you an example, I started here in 1986. The average litter size, I think we were excited if we got 9, and then everybody was shooting for 10, right? So now if you only had 10 pigs born alive, you'd be culling that sow because you want like 14 or 15. And so while the number born alive has increased, probably the average birth weight has increased some, but not to the same extent. So what you tend to have is maybe gilts that are sort of less developed when they're born. and that may have some implications for their adult sort of lifetime productivity in terms of things. So that's been the biggest change. We've seen a lot of that in a lot of aspects, right? Not only in gilt development, but in some of the market animals and things like that.
So is that then you indicated birth weight has more of a range now? Is this phenomenon then across that entire birth weight range, or is it more prone to, let's call it, the smaller piglets that are born?
Yeah, I think what's kind of interesting to us in the data we've analyzed, and so the way we would do these studies for sow longevity or gilt development is we would go into a multiplication farm. We would measure individual birth weight, litter birth weights, number born alive, number of pigs nursing and things like that on that multiplier farm. And then once those piglets are weaned, we would track them through the rest of their development and then track their reproductive performance when they were delivered to sow, to commercial sow farms. And then we go back and say, okay, let's look at these factors such as litter size or number nursing or birth weight, and then how they're associated with lifetime productivity. And you can measure that as, how many litters the sow had or how many total pigs the sow produced over its lifetime. So we use different multiple regression techniques to do that. So what we find is, in our data set at least, that about 50% of the variation in lifetime productivity of a sow can be explained by variation from the time that piglet is born to the time that it's weaned, right? So that's the neonatal period. And George Foxcroft, the late George Foxcroft, I think he was the first one to use the term, or the first one that I remember using the term. He coined it litter of origin variables. So what that means is if I have a sow in production on a commercial farm and one only produced, say, weaned 10 pigs over her lifetime and the other weaned like 100, that could be due to probably because one stayed in production for 6 parities and one was culled after the first litter. That variation between 10 and 100, like 50% of that is correlated to differences or variation in like average pig birth weight or number of pigs weaned or things like that. It tends to be the smaller pigs, but what we've tended to see as litter size has gotten larger, then what we would consider a small pig is actually changed, right? So for example, in 1986, a small pig would be like less than 3 pounds, right? Because all of our pigs would be more than 3 pounds because of the small litter size. So now, we used to say now a small pig is like 2.5 or 2.3 pounds, right? So I think the population has changed, if you will, and it's kind of spread. So the big pigs are probably going to be fine. And the small pigs we know are bad, but somewhere in the middle where, most of our variation is, that window may actually be getting, like, we need a heavier and heavier pig for that pig to be successful as an adult.
So what are then some critical periods for reproductive organ development in those gilts?
It's kind of interesting. For the gilt, I like to use the analogy of kind of building a car engine. And so most of the organs, if you will, their growth potential is pretty much set when that gilt is born. So a couple hours after life, and we'll talk about colostrum in a minute, hopefully, but certainly after they've gotten colostrum, their potential for how big that ovary or uteri could be as an adult has been set. And so that's kind of you build the building blocks. And then through the rest of lactation and maybe even after weaning, the reproductive organs learn how to communicate or talk to one another. And so the analogy is that the engines are the potential's there. As the rest of the developmental period, they grow, they get bigger, and they learn how to communicate with one another. And so that's another piece. And then the last piece is what we were talking about at the very beginning. The bore exposure and when you do it and how you do it on the farm is kind of when you put the key in the ignition of your car and turn it to see if it starts and goes fast, right? And so that's kind of those are kind of the 3 critical periods of how I kind of break it down and stuff like. So the engine is really built during gestation or late gestation and maybe in that early lactation period. And then it kind of grows up. You amplify it during the rest of the development. They learn how to communicate with one another through nerves and hormones, et cetera. And then you start the engine when you give that female boar exposure on the commercial farm.
So when you also mentioned gestation, and of course you mentioned some things right after birth. So how important is that late gestation period?
It's probably more important than we ever thought it was, in my opinion. So I think people have, looked at it for years and kind of looked at it as a period of, we know that the pig, there's a lot of growth and development in that last sort of 1/3 of gestation, which is the pig is probably around days 75 and 80 on to the end. And so that's, if you look at it, that's when you get a lot of your final growth and reproductive organ development and things like that. So that's pretty critical. The interesting thing, since I know you're a well-known swine nutritionist, is, we used to think that we could just feed the sow more during that and change birth weight and development. And I think, there's lots of studies that suggest that that may not be the most efficient strategy. But what I've been encouraged about, and I don't have all the details, but, I've seen lots of work over the past 10 or 15 years where people are targeting key nutrients that might enhance a certain aspect of development. So there's been work with arginine and folic acid and some other things as well. And so in my mind, that might be the key, because once that gilt is born, just for an example, the number of eggs that a gilt has in her ovary that she'll sort of use the rest of her life to produce litter sizes, that's pretty much set when that pig's born, that gilt's born. So that ovarian development is pretty much set from the time she's born, and then she'll just lose eggs the rest of her life, but they're never replenished. And so, and most of that egg development occurs during that last kind of portion of gestation as well. So
you're suggesting specifically to look at, you mentioned amino acid nutrition, you mentioned vitamin nutrition, fatty acids perhaps play a role as well?
Fatty acids play a really important role as well. And so the key, I think, and I'm not a developmental biologist, but those patterns of how they're utilized by the fetus and in terms of its development probably isn't consistent. So it might be the sequence that you feed them in addition to just feeding them at the end, right? So it could be that you need more amino acids first to set up a transport system to get the fatty acids in, or the vitamins might need to be in concert with some of those because they usually work as cofactors and stuff like that. So I think people have really started to look at that in more detail, and it's kind of exciting and stuff, I think, and then there's, there's this whole idea that the sow probably does, in late gestation might go into some aspect of gestational diabetes or things like that. And so then that comes into play and how that affects, fetal development and things like that as well. So that's, in my mind, not being a nutritionist, and you would know a lot more about it than I did, but to me, that's a very exciting area for the future that has some real practical implications. You could implement that in a multiplication farm and hopefully, make a lot of, and so then that may be the key, right? You may be able to take a small birth weight gilt, or if our birth weights are going to stay low, but you could still enhance the development of those organs independent of her birth weight by targeting key things like that. So.
Now, you also mentioned the lactation period. You mentioned colostrum. What are some key targets there to think of?
Yeah, so colostrum is really kind of interesting, and I think people have recognized the benefit of colostrum for a long time in terms of piglet survival and also providing, their passive immunity. And I guess Skip Bartol and Carol Bagnell, two of my colleagues here in the States, forwarded this idea of the lactocrine hypothesis, where there are things in colostrum and milk, bioactive compounds in colostrum and milk that actually stimulate reproductive tract development and stuff. And so, and there's pretty good evidence that occurs. Skip's done a lot of, and Carol have done a lot of the basic work in that area. Jeff Fillet, when he was at Clay Center, and then we've followed up on some of the work that Jeff has done, looking at colostrum intake in future replacement gilts, and then what effect that has on their lifetime productivity. And so what Jeff developed a really neat, simple way to estimate colostrum intake called the immunocrit. Take a real small blood sample from a day-old pig, and you kind of precipitate out the immunoglobulins and then spin it down, and you measure that just like you would the hematocrit in a blood sample. And in Jeff's data, and then we've taken a little bit of a different approach, but our data, gilts that have a higher immunocrit at day 2 or day 1, in our case day 1, in his case of day 2 of life, actually, I think Jeff followed them through the first parity. They reached puberty earlier, they had a higher farrowing rate, more of them entered production, and they had a larger litter size, their first parity. And we followed them through, or currently following in some of our commercial farms here through their lifetime productivity. They actually, right now, the ones with the highest immunocrits are averaging about 20 to 25 more pigs produced over their lifetime. And that again, that could be a combination of they stay in production longer, or they wean more pigs per litter, but it's a combination of the two. So that really critical period is that first 24 hours when colostrum is there. And then if you look at some of the work that a lot of the lactational biologists have done, one of your colleagues, Dr. Chantel Farmer there in Canada, she's one of my favorite people that interact with in Canada. I call her the Dairy Queen. She's my Dairy Queen, right? So I have a lactation question. I ask Chantel, and she knows all the answers. But if you look at some of the work they've done, the quality of colostrum actually decreases pretty rapidly after that sow starts farrowing. So it might be the first 12 to 16 hours where it's really important for them to get that kind of boost, if you will. From my perspective, hopefully there's younger and smarter people out there that'll figure this out. But if there are things that are important for reproductive tract development in pigs in the colostrum or the early milk, and we can identify them, then we may not have to rely on the pig nursing the sow to get them. We may be able just to give a dose or an injection during processing or something like that, and then all the pigs can get the same amount and stuff. So
we talked about gestation, we talked about lactation. Are there any then concerns between weaning all the way up to a properly developed gilt? Like are there other concerns?
Yeah, I think so. The analogy I'll use a little bit, and this is just my interpretation of the data and the work that we've done and others have done, is that that early period is really, you've got your potential, the potential for your reproductive organs to develop to their full potential is set. And then after weaning in other places, you don't want to do things to restrict that development, but you really want to enhance the development. So it's kind of interesting, because if you look at growth rate and different diets, and there's been a lot of work that would suggest that if you slow an animal down or speed it up at different phases before, that can have some positive and negative effects. And if you look at all the data in a big sense, it seems to be there's a minimum growth rate or a minimum level that needs to be met. And if it's met that, then they're going to be very successful as an adult when you start giving boar exposure. Now, depending on the production system, for example, if you like your sows older before they're bred for the first time, then there probably does make sense to slow their growth rate down during that period. But as long as you're above that minimum, right? Or if you want to get them introduced in introduced earlier, then maybe you want to speed them up. I'm still think that there's an area probably after pigs would leave what we consider the nursery phase, toward the end of when they would reach puberty, that there may not be some advantages to some strategic sort of nutritional programs with amino acids and things like that to help kind of the final kind of development or maturation of the hypothalamic pituitary axis. So it's something that hasn't really been studied recently, but if you look at the literature that's coming out about all the kispeptins and the leptins and things like that that are going on in the brain, there may be some opportunities there. So, well, it's kind of interesting, though. I think this is why I guess that those of us that stay in research for so long do. It's fun because once a discovery is made in one area, then it opens up more opportunities to go, hey, we never thought about this. We should take a look at that. And so I think that's what's exciting. Yeah.
Yeah. So key is minimum growth needs to be met.
Exactly.
Can gilts grow too fast? Like, is there
a lot of some of the work that actually one of the last papers that George and Jenny Patterson published, there is a subset of gilts that grow too fast, and the challenge there is they usually get called out because of feet and leg problems or things like that. So you're right. You're exactly right. There's this acceptable range in both too fast and too slow. Could potentially be a problem as well.
Are there then any measurements that can be used to estimate subsequent lifetime productivity of gilts?
Yeah, it's kind of, if you look at all the studies that looked at the association, birth weight seems to be somewhat correlated. Weaning weight does as well. In terms of looking at things individually, the immunocrit the immunocrit seems to be a pretty good measure for the potential, right? So then after that, I think if they have a high immunocrit, then you need to make sure they kind of grow at a steady rate and things like that. We've tried different things, like to for example, one of the things we tried years ago was to give a low dose of PG600 at different times, just to see if we could see if the ovary, we didn't want the ovary to ovulate, but we wanted to see if the follicles on the ovary would produce progesterone, and then you could see the response and stuff, and that didn't really pan out well. And people have measured lots of things like different aspects of the vulva, of the reproductive tract, to kind of estimate stuff. And it seems like there's some marginal associations, but they can fall apart pretty easy, depend on the data set you're looking at and stuff. So I think the best thing now is you get a pretty large, you get a reasonable size birth weight pig, make sure they get lots of colostrum, right? Lots of milk. And when they're weaned, there's a minimum growth rate. And then at the end, make sure you get your boar exposure right. I mean, that's the thing. So what's interesting is I do spend quite a bit of time when the commercial farms are having problems with gilts being bred or not coming into heat. We'll have them send a subset. We'll have them send a subset to a local abattoir, and then we'll do a slaughter check. We'll look at the reproductive tracts, and we'll look at the ovaries. And I tell people the ovaries never lie, right? So if I look at an ovary and it has really nice developed follicles in corpora albicantia and corpora lutea, then they just missed estrus, right? The gilt was there. But what's interesting is, and there's, I would say, about, of the farms I've looked at over the last 5 years, probably about 35 to 40% of the gilts are in that category. So there's still this challenge with detecting boar exposure. What we have noticed, though, is that there's about 30 to 40% of the gilts that have what I would call underdeveloped ovaries. So they have smaller ovaries. They maybe have only 1 or 2 corpora lutea. And so these are ones that they may never have found in heat on the farms, or they may be the ones that they find in heat once and then they don't breed back. Most farms do a heat nose serve, so they detect them in heat once, and then you hear the complaint, well, they never came back into heat again. And my bias is that these may be the ones way back when that may have been the smaller birth weight pigs, or the ones that didn't quite get enough colostrum, and their ovaries didn't have quite the reproductive potential as the others. And so everything else was the same. At post-development, everything was normal, right? But their machinery, if you will, just wasn't enough to respond in an adult type of fashion or things like that. So it's just, I don't have any, obviously that's anecdotal evidence, but we have seen a lot of those. And some of the controlled studies we've done, the smaller birth weight pigs that didn't grow as well during the lactation period, when we follow them through and they were the ones that didn't get bred and introduced on a commercial swine farm. When we followed up on the slaughter check, the majority of those had those type of that ovarian phenotype or morphology. There's they ovulated, but there's just not very many corpolutea and stuff. And so,
would there be any tie to like adipose mass or protein mass?
It could be. We didn't look at that, but that could very well be. I mean, all of that's tied in, right? So it could be that and it could be as we talked about earlier, maybe they were on a growth trajectory, but it wasn't the right type of growth, right? It may have been too fast or too slow, or not enough amino acids at the right time and things like that.
So what is then the best first step or steps for production systems if they want to improve gilt development or lifetime productivity of these cells?
So I think you have to kind of know where you are and kind of maybe get an assessment of what your problem might be. And so I think the best thing to do is, I always tell our graduate students here, and it's certainly in my career, I've learned more from my failures and my successes, right? So if you're a commercial farm, your failures are the gilts that you don't get bred or you don't find in heat. So set up a system, work with somebody that can help you. Just take a look at the ovaries and see what's there. So if most of your ovarian morphology in your slaughter check is a normal CL, a normally developed ovary, then your problem is more exposure heat detection. If you have undeveloped ovaries or ovaries with very few CLs or few CAs, then it's probably somewhere in the gilt development. And my bias would be it would probably be somewhere sort of in the early developmental period in the multiplier and how those gilts are managed, after birth and the colostrum and things like that. So that would be a good first step.
Yep. So bottom line is actually cull the cells and not just remove them from the farm, but actually do a post-mortem and detect internally.
And then, the tendency is that it's kind of like I'll use another analogy, the replacement gilt that's sent to the commercial farm is kind of like that new car you've just bought, and so like the ones that you've paid a lot of money for that new car, so you're going to give it lots of chances to run well instead of going, this car's a lemon, I need to get another one. And sometimes it's better to take a subset and really try to find out what's going on and stuff. So
it's time for our famous three.
Swine Veterinary Partners comprises 4 well-established clinics across Canada: Precision Veterinary Services, Premier SHP, Demeter, Ontario, and Demeter, Quebec.
Yeah, interesting. So in this line of research or swine production, what is one of your favorite resources that you go back to read up upon?
So I like to. It's kind of interesting. There's really 2 things. I always like to talk to the people that work on the farms, and so I learn more when I go visit farms. I feel guilty because I learn a lot more than in the knowledge that I impart. So and if you listen to them, they can tell you they're with the animals every day. They can tell you what they do. They observe sort of interesting things that are different. And then when you go to different farms, you begin to hear the same thing for the farms that are having the same problems or the same successes, and that kind of helps you. And then I always like to go back to the older literature. And don't get me wrong, but I'll just say it. Our science is the fact that we've been able to describe and sort of isolate things kind of down to the gene and subgene and things like that, which is really great. But at the end of the day, at least in what I do, is I'm dealing with a whole animal in a production system. And some of the older research that's been published, it's been out there for years, we think we get smarter than we are, and we come back and you go, that paper published in 1968 was right. And then one just to give me an example, Dr. Phil Juck, who was a pioneer in reproductive biology, Phil, but he used to say, and he'd always say you need at least 4 viable embryos at day 12 for the sow to stay pregnant, right? And so he's right. It's like we can do a lot of things, but if the sow doesn't have 4 embryos at day 12, she's not going to be pregnant. And then we know now that if a sow has only 5 embryos at day 12, she's probably going to lose a couple before implantation. So she's probably not going to stay pregnant for the rest of the pregnancy, right? So it's so you always have to remind myself to go back and think about the basic stuff that's been published, a long time ago that maybe people have forgotten and stuff. So,
well, thanks very much. This concludes another episode of the Swine Podcast Show Canada. And with that, thanks very much, Dr. Flowers.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.